In the previous lecture, we went through price determination, specifically on how to use demand and supply analysis to explain what will happen to the equilibrium price and quantity in a market when there is a change in demand condition. We also went through the step-by-step analysis in explaining the price adjustment process, in which the market will adjust itself back to equilibrium when there is a change in demand condition. So these are the 5 steps which we have went through in the previous lecture. For today's lecture, we will continue from where we stopped. Please refer to page 26 of your lecture notes. We will attempt to illustrate the next 2 cases found in the Test Yourself box in your lecture notes. We will be using a diagram and we will explain what will be the impact on the market equilibrium price and quantity when the following scenario or situation occurs. Now let's take a look at Part B. Part B, there is an increase in supply, ceteris paribus. To begin our analysis, let's draw our diagram first. On our vertical axis, we have price. Horizontal axis, we have quantity of the good. Draw in our supply and our demand curve. The point at which these 2 curves intersect, that will be our market equilibrium point. We will label that as E0. And P0 will be our market equilibrium price. Q0, our market equilibrium quantity. For this case, there is an increase in supply. So when there is an increase in supply, your supply curve will shift to the right. From S to S1. Now you notice that your new supply curve intersects your demand curve at this point. This will be your new market equilibrium point, and we're going to label that as E1 with new market equilibrium price P1 and equilibrium quantity Q1. So you notice that for this scenario, when there is an increase in supply, the equilibrium price of the good will fall from P0 to P1. Equilibrium quantity of the good will increase from Q0 to Q1. Now, what actually caused this price to fall from P0 to P1? And this is where we will need to use the adjustment process to help us to explain. Now, to explain the price adjustment process, recall we need to follow these 5 steps. First step, at the original equilibrium price P0, identify the quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So at the original equilibrium price P0 here, you can actually extend the price line so that it's easier for you to see. Quantity demanded will be a point on the demand curve at the price of P0, which is here. So this will be your quantity demanded, which is actually equals to Q0. Now, next, find out what is your quantity supply. Quantity supplied will be a point on your new supply curve, which is S1, at the price of P0, which is here. So from this diagram, you can see that your quantity supply is more than your quantity demanded, and therefore there is a surplus in the market. So what will happen when there is a surplus? Which group of people will actually react in the market? Is it consumers or is it producers? Now, who will be the one who will be holding on to the excess stocks, which is surplus? Producers, right? So in this case, your producers will react. Now, how do the producers react? In this case, they will want to get rid of the excess stocks. And how do they get rid of the excess stocks? Yes, they will actually reduce the price of the good. So when they reduce the price of the good, it will actually cause a downward pressure on the price. Okay, so your price will start to fall. So what happens when your price starts to fall from P0? What will happen to your quantity demanded and quantity supplied? We have learned the law of demand, which tells us that there is an inverse relationship between the price and quantity demanded of the good. So when the price of the good falls, quantity demanded of the good will increase. How do we show this on the diagram? When price starts to fall, quantity demanded will start to increase. So it's a movement downward along your demand curve. And when price starts to fall, quantity supply will fall. The law of supply tells us there is a direct relationship between the price and the quantity supply of the good. And therefore, when price falls, quantity supply will fall. And how do we show this on the diagram? When price falls from P0, quantity supply will fall. So it's a movement downward along your new supply curve S1. So this process will continue until the market reaches the new equilibrium point E1. Because at this equilibrium point E1, your quantity demanded is equals to your quantity supplied once again, and therefore the market clears because it's back to equilibrium. As a result, your new market equilibrium price will be P1, market equilibrium quantity will be Q1. Now, let's take a look at part C. For part C, there is a fall in supply. So when there is a fall in supply, your supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, don't forget series backward. So we're going to keep everything else remaining constant. So let's begin by drawing our diagram first. We have price, we have quantity. Supply, demand. Okay, so the intersects here. So this is my market equilibrium point E0 with equilibrium price P0, equilibrium quantity Q0. So when there's a fall in supply, supply curve will shift to the left, okay, to S1. So what happens when supply curve shifts to the left? You notice your new supply curve intersects your demand curve at this point. So this is your new market equilibrium point E1. Your market equilibrium price will be P1 and market equilibrium quantity Q1. So if you compare, you realize that the price of the good has increased from P0 to P1. Equilibrium quantity has dropped from Q0 to Q1. But what causes the price to increase from P0 to P1? Okay, let's make use of the adjustment process to help us. So first step, at the original equilibrium price P0, identify the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. So quantity demanded will be a point on the demand curve at the price of P0, which is here. Okay, so in this case it's the same as Q0. Quantity supply will be a point on the supply curve at the price of P0, which is here. Okay, so what can you see? Your quantity demanded is more than your quantity supplied. This implies, yes, there is a shortage in the market. So when there's a shortage in the market, who will react? Is it the consumers or is it the producers? Yes, consumers will react. So what would consumers do? They will beat up the price of the good so that they can obtain the good. So what this means is that they will be willing to pay a higher price for the good, and that will cause an upward pressure on the price. Do take note that you cannot write short form in exams, okay? So you got to spell out under exam condition or test condition. So when there is an upward pressure on the price, your price of the good will start to increase. So let's do our analysis again. What happens to quantity demanded and quantity supplied? When price increase, quantity demanded will fall. So how do we show this on the diagram? When price starts to increase, quantity demanded will start to fall. Okay, so it's a movement upward along your demand curve. And when price increase, quantity supply will increase. Okay, so it's a movement upward along your new supply curve. So this process of consumers bidding with higher prices and producers increasing their output will continue until the new market equilibrium is achieved, which is at point E1. Because at this point, your quantity demanded will be equals to your quantity supplied once again, and therefore your new market equilibrium quantity is Q1 and your market equilibrium price would be P1. So you notice that so far what we have illustrated is a case whereby either the demand or the supply curve has shifted, meaning there is a change in either demand or supply factor. However, in reality, you will notice that both demand and supply condition could change at the same time, and this is where we're going to move on to the next section, 4.4. What happens when both demand and supply condition change at the same time? Now, for such questions, you have to follow the 5 steps stated here. First step, look at the scenario that's given to you, which could be in the preamble of an essay or in the case study abstracts. Identify whether the scenario illustrated a change in demand or supply factor or both. Now, the scenarios could be more than one, so you have to read very carefully. After you have done that, move to point 2. Identify whether it is a price or non-price factor. Step 3. Identify the direction of change. If it's a non-price factor, then would demand increase or decrease? Or would supply increase or decrease? And therefore, step 4, is that a movement or a shift of the curve? Last step is to explain the price adjustment process, which we have practiced earlier. Now, when do you need to explain the price adjustment process? You need to do this when the question asks about the impact on the market. When the question asks you on the impact on the market, basically they want you to tell them what would happen to the equilibrium price and quantity. Or you could have a question that will test you on the impact on the equilibrium price of the good. So for such questions, as long as the questions require you to tell them the impact on the equilibrium price, you will need to explain the price adjustment process. So we're going to use a scenario to help us, okay, to practice these important steps. Now we're going to look at a case, okay, where there's an increase in both demand and supply of the good. So when there's an increase in both demand and supply of the good, both the demand and supply curve will shift to the right. From this diagram, you notice that the equilibrium quantity will increase from Q1 to Q2, but the equilibrium price, as shown in the diagram, has dropped from P1 to P2. But this is a special case in the sense that you notice something else happens in the diagram. You notice that the shape of the supply curve is much more than the shift in your demand curve. And this is exactly the reasons why the equilibrium price of the good has dropped from P1 to P2. And therefore, when you look at such case, the equilibrium price actually is dependent on the relative magnitudes of the increase in demand and supply. So what do I mean by relative magnitude of the increase in demand and supply of the good? When we look at the relative magnitude of the increase in demand and supply of the good, we are actually looking at the extent to which demand and supply curves shift with respect to each other. What do I mean by that? It could be a case whereby the increase in demand is more than the increase in supply. So for this case, your demand curve will shift more than the shift of the supply curve. Or it could be a case where the increase in demand is less than the increase in supply. So for this second case, the demand curve will actually shift to a lesser extent as compared to the shift of the supply curve. And the last case will be a case whereby the increase in demand is equals to the increase in supply. So for this case, it will be an equal shift of both curves. Okay, so now let's take a look at the first case. Okay, let's take a look at case 1. Increase in supply is greater than the increase in demand. So if you look at your figure 18 here, increase in demand is greater than the increase in supply, and therefore we shifted our supply curve from S1 to S2 but by a larger extent as compared to the rightward shift of your demand curve from D1 to D2. Okay? I need you to change this to figure 18. Okay, so when the increase in supply is greater than the increase in demand as illustrated in figure 18.1, there is a surplus at the original equilibrium price OP1. How do we know that? Now let's put to practice what we have been doing so far. So if you look at figure 18, at the original price of P1, what you could do is you could actually extend the price line across. Okay, so step number 1, find out what is the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied at the price of OP1. Okay, quantity demanded will always be a point on your demand curve. Okay, in this case on your new demand curve at the price of P1, which is here. Okay, so this quantity demanded, your quantity supply, okay, which is this amount here. So quantity supply will be a point on your new supply curve at the price of P1, which is here. Okay, so if you draw it down, it will be an amount here. Okay, so what do you notice? Your quantity supply is more than your quantity demanded. So this implies that there is a surplus in the market. So if there is a surplus in the market, who will react? Surplus means excess stocks. So producers will be the one who will be holding on to these excess stocks. So what will they do? They will try to get rid of these excess stocks. And how do they do that? Yes, they will actually sell it at a lower price. So this will cause a downward pressure on the price. So when your price starts to fall, quantity demanded will start to increase. Okay, so it's a movement down along your new demand curve. Quantity supply will fall, movement downward along your supply curve. So the adjustment process will continue until the market reaches this new equilibrium point. Let's label this as E2. Okay, because at this market equilibrium point E2, your quantity demanded will be equals to your quantity supplied once again. So therefore the market clears. And Q2 will be your equilibrium quantity that is traded in the market or sold in the market. OP2 will be your equilibrium price. Alright, so all the explanations is written here in this paragraph. Now let's look at this case. Case 2. Increase in supply is less than the increase in demand. So if the increase in supply is less than the increase in demand, I will need to shift my supply curve to a lesser extent as compared to the shift in demand curve. So now let's take a look at this case. What happens? Now at the original equilibrium price of OP1, again, you could actually draw or extend the price line across so that it's easier for you to see. Okay, identify the quantity demanded at the price of P1, which must be on your new demand curve, which is here. Okay, so you can draw it down to your horizontal axis and it will represent a certain amount of quantity. Quantity supply will be a point on your new supply curve at the price of P1, which is here. Okay, so again it's a certain amount. Right, so if you compare, you notice your quantity demanded is more than your quantity supplied. So this implies that there is a shortage in the market. So what will happen when there's a shortage in the market? Yes, consumers will react. How will consumers react? They will bid up the price of the good in order to obtain the good. So this will cause an upward pressure on the price, and when your price starts to increase, your quantity supply will increase. So it's a movement upward along your supply curve, and when your price starts to increase, your quantity demanded will start to fall. So the market will continue to adjust until it reaches the market equilibrium point, E2 here, because at this market equilibrium points, this is where the market clears. Why? Because your quantity demanded will be equals to your quantity supplied once again, and therefore Q2, OQ2 will be your equilibrium quantity, OP2 will be your equilibrium price. Okay, so the explanation is all written here in this paragraph. You just need to change again, the labeling. Okay, instead of figure 17, it should be figure 18. Now let's take a look at this test yourself box. What happens when the increase in supply is equals to the increase in demand? So this will be a case whereby both the curve will shift by the same extent. So let's try and draw together. So I have price, I have quantity on my axis, supply, demand, market equilibrium point E0, equilibrium price P0, equilibrium quantity Q0. Okay, so increase in supply will shift to the right, okay, to S1. Increase in demand will shift to the right, but by the same extent as compared to the supply curve. Okay, so this is my demand, we shifted to the right. So now let's take a look at what happens to the market. Now let's take a look at what happens to the market. At the market equilibrium price of OP0, which is your original market equilibrium price. Extend the price line. Now find out what is your quantity demanded. You notice your quantity demanded is here. Quantity supply is also here, correct? Why? Because this point is where both your supply curve and your demand curve intersects. It's your new market equilibrium point. Okay, so your new market equilibrium quantity will be OQ1. Equilibrium price will be OP0, which is the same as even if you write it as the new equilibrium price OP1, because it's the same. There's no change in price at all. So what have changed here is just the equilibrium quantity has increased. Alright? Now, we gotta move on to the next part. Okay? The next part requires us to explain the impact on the equilibrium price and quantity for the following situations. For these three cases. 1. What happens when both demand and supply decreases? 2. What happens when demand increases and supply decreases? And 3. Demand decreases and supply increases at the same time. We have given you the answers here, so you should be practicing on your own to try and see if you can arrive at this answer. Okay, to help you a bit, we are going to try for case number 1. And you got to practice 2 and 3. Okay, you have to practice 2 and 3 on your own. Now let's try. First case, both demand and supply decrease. So demand decrease, supply also decrease. Okay, so for this case, I need to show 3 different types of possible scenarios. Okay, so number 1, what happens when demand fall more than the fall in supply? Second one, what happens when the demand fall but less than the fall in supply? And the third case, what happens when the fall in demand is equals to the fall in supply? Okay, we're going to do each of these cases now together. Let's draw our diagram. So intersection of both demand and supply will determine our market equilibrium point. I'm going to label that as E0. Equilibrium price P0. Equilibrium quantity Q0. For in demand will shift left. Okay, but take note, it will shift more than the shift in your supply curve. So I'm going to shift it by this much to D1. So it shifted to the left to D1. Supply falls, shift left too, but it shift left by a lesser extent. So I'm going to shift it, for example, by this much to S1. So based on this diagram, you notice that your supply curve and your demand curve intersects at this point here. This is your new market equilibrium point. I'm going to label that as E1. Your equilibrium price is P1 and equilibrium quantity Q1. So from this diagram, you can see that your equilibrium price has dropped from P0 to P1. Equilibrium quantity has dropped from Q0 to Q0. But what causes this price, okay, equilibrium price, to drop from P0 to P1? So we need to know how to explain the adjustment process. Okay, so let's take a look at this price. What happens? Now at this original market equilibrium price of OP0 or P0, find out what is the quantity demanded or the quantity supply. Okay, so quantity demanded must always be a point on the demand curve at that particular price, which is in this case P0. So this will be quantity demanded, which is this amount, which I'm not going to draw the line down, otherwise it's going to be very confusing. Okay, quantity supply will be a point on the supply curve at the price of P0, which is here. Okay, again, it's this amount, because your horizontal axis represents the quantity. So I'm not going to draw the line down, otherwise it's going to be very, very confusing. Okay, so you notice that from this diagram, your quantity supply is more than your quantity demanded. So what does this imply? This implies that there is a surplus. So there's excess stocks of this good in the market. So producers will react, right? So producers will react to reduce the price. in order to get rid of the stocks. So when they react by reducing the price, it will cause a downward pressure on the price, and when your price starts to go down, quantity demanded will increase. So it's a movement down along your demand curve. Quantity supply will decrease. So it's a movement downwards along your supply curve until the market reaches this new market equilibrium point E1, because at this point here, your quantity demanded will be equal to your quantity supply, right? So therefore the market clears. Okay, and therefore your equilibrium quantity will be Q1, equilibrium price will be P1. Alright, now let's take a look at case 2. Let's take a look at case 2. Okay, we have price, quantity, supply, demand. Okay, intersects at this point here, market equilibrium point E0, equilibrium price P0, equilibrium quantity Q0. Now for this case, the fall in your supply is more than the fall in demand, so your supply curve must shift by a greater extent. Okay, so supply falls, shift left, but I'm going to shift it by a lot, okay, by this much to S1. Demand also falls, so it will shift to the left, but it will shift by a lesser extent, so let's say this much to D1. Okay, so from this diagram, you can see that the two curves intersect at this point here. So this is your new market equilibrium point E1 with the market equilibrium price of P1, market equilibrium quantity Q1, correct? So you notice that your equilibrium price has increased, equilibrium quantity has decreased. Now what causes this price to increase from P0 to P1? So again, we're going to use the adjustment process to help us. So let's take a look at the original market equilibrium price P0. Find out what is your quantity supply and quantity demanded. Okay, so quantity supply will be a point on your new supply curve at the price of P0, which is here, so it's this amount here. Okay, but we're not going to label that down. Alright, so QS. Quantity demanded is a point on your demand curve, new demand curve here, but at the price of P0, so it's this point here. Okay, so it's this amount, because this is quantity. So from here, you notice that your quantity demanded is more than your quantity supply. So this implies that there is a shortage. So when there is a shortage, consumers will react how? By bidding up the price. So when your price starts to increase, quantity demanded will fall. Okay, so it's a movement upward along your demand curve, and when your price increase, your quantity supply will increase, so it's a movement upward along your supply curve until the market reaches this new market equilibrium price market equilibrium point E1 with a new market equilibrium price of P1 and equilibrium quantity Q1, because this point here the market clears. Your quantity demanded is equal to your quantity supply once again. Okay, so this is your new market equilibrium price, market equilibrium quantity. Now let's take a look at the last case. What happens when the fall in demand is equal to the fall in supply? Okay, draw in your supply, demand, intersects at this point here, so this is your market equilibrium quantity will be Q0, price will be P0. Okay, so for this part it's an equal shift, so I'm going to shift my supply curve to the left because there's a fall in supply, so shifting it to the left by this much. Demand also falls, so it's going to shift to the left, but by the same extent, right, because it's equal. Okay, so this is my demand curve, we shifted to D1. Okay, so from this diagram you can see very clearly that your two curves intersects at this point here. Okay, so this is your new market equilibrium point E1. Now, you notice that your price remains unchanged at P0. Why? Because at this market equilibrium point E1, your quantity is equals to your quantity demanded is equals to your quantity supplied. So there is no shortage and there's no surplus. Okay. However, because of the fall in supply and the fall in demand, your equilibrium quantity decreased, okay, from Q0 to Q1. Alright? So, you have to practice on your own for the other two cases. Okay, two scenarios. What happens when demand increases and when supply decreases? So, three cases. Okay, demand increase, supply decrease. So you got to illustrate number one, the first case, increase in demand more than the fall in supply. Second case, increase in demand less than the fall in supply. And the third one, increase in demand equals to the fall in supply. Okay, all this refers to the extent to which both curves will shift. Okay, and same goes for the third scenario. Okay, fall in demand, increase in supply. So illustrate a case when your fall in demand is more than the increase in supply. Second case, fall in demand less than the increase in supply. And the third case, fall in demand equals to the increase in supply. Okay, so for all these 6 cases, okay, you got to tell me what is the impact on the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Okay, and when you explain the equilibrium price, you got to make sure that you know how to explain the adjustment process. Alright, so that will be all for today. For the next lecture, when you come back, we will be continuing with the last portion of the notes, which is section 4.5, where you will look at the applications of price determination, how government will intervene in the market, okay, using either taxation, okay, or subsidies, or even price control, okay, to intervene in the market. Alright, thank you everybody. That's all for today.